Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 21 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. My intention is for each episode in this series to stand on its own, but if you're the sort of person who likes to have the full context of a story, those earlier episodes are available to go back and listen to in the same place you found this one. Last time, I talked about the fall of Nikita Khrushchev and the rise of his deputy, Leonid Brezhnev, to replace him as General Secretary of the Communist Party, the de facto ruler of the USSR. This week, I will explore Brezhnev's political philosophy, or lack thereof, and begin my discussion of life in the Brezhnev-era Soviet Union. This is The End of History, Part 21. As a lover of ancient history, for as long as I can remember, I've been an admirer of the Roman Emperor Augustus. Indeed, the room in which I write the outlines of these episodes is decorated with a plaster statue of the emperor that I purchased during my visit to the Eternal City in 2009. The most magnetic thing about Augustus as a historical figure, in my opinion, is the fact that there are so many different versions of the man to study and admire. This is partially by his own design. As emperor, he took great pains to ensure that he was seen by contemporaries and remembered by posterity as a multifaceted man who could be admired by anyone for many different reasons. In other words, depending on who you are and what you believe, Augustus ensured that there was some aspect of his character that would appeal to you, thus making his appeal universal. He was simultaneously a champion of the poor and a conservative elder statesman, a fiery revolutionary and a committed moderate, a strong autocrat and a humble defender of republican virtue. While this is partially due to his propaganda painting him the way he wanted to be seen, it is also partially because he was such a complicated and fascinating individual, with so many aspects to his personality. While I have always been fascinated with the story of Rome's first emperor, I've found myself drawn to different attributes and different periods of his life. As a young man, I was drawn to the story of his rise, how a bookish teenager, constantly underestimated by his older, more experienced rivals, swam in the shark-infested waters of Roman politics, and eventually outmaneuvered them all to become the most powerful man in Rome. Now that I'm a little older, I'm 35, I'm more drawn to Augustus the enlightened despot, who brought moderation, stability, and competent administration to a Roman Empire that had suffered from chronic instability and endemic civil war for nearly a century. It's fair to point out that he did that by establishing an autocracy, and I'm absolutely opposed to that. But stability and competent leadership? I'll take some of that, please. Augustus is notable in that, though he established himself as an autocrat, he rarely overtly exercised his autocratic powers, often deferring to the Senate and maintaining the pretense that Rome was still a republic, and that he was merely the princeps, or first citizen. It's the reason he died of old age, safe in his bed, instead of by an assassin's knife like his great-uncle Julius Caesar. He understood better than most one of the great truths of being a ruler. Most people want to be ruled over, but especially powerful people hate being told that they're being ruled over. They want the illusion of autonomy and control. If you feed their egos and make them feel powerful, they will usually follow just about anywhere you lead. Augustus fed the egos of the powerful old men in the Roman Senate. Many centuries later, Leonid Brezhnev applied this same strategy to the old men of the Soviet Politburo. Don't get me wrong, I'm not comparing the quality of Brezhnev's leadership to that of Augustus. It was only the style of rule that was similar, not the substance. Augustus is frequently, and I think rightly, ranked among the greatest leaders in world history. Brezhnev is not. And in my opinion, Brezhnev is probably in the bottom third. Not among the worst of the worst necessarily, but definitely below average. That said, Brezhnev did have decent political instincts. He understood that his predecessor, Khrushchev, had been ousted not because of the party leadership's disagreement with his policies, though there certainly were some. Rather, Khrushchev was ousted because of his style of leadership. Khrushchev knew he possessed a great deal of power because of his role as general secretary, and he wielded that power like a club, often simply giving orders to people and ignoring the proper political procedures. He saw himself as a bold reformer, cutting through the red tape to accomplish necessary reforms. The rest of the party saw him as a bully, lording over them and constantly diminishing and humiliating them. So, in October 1964, they banded together to oust him, and they replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev. If you want more details on that process, I recommend you go listen to last week's episode, where I covered the fall of Khrushchev in detail. Brezhnev understood the mistakes of his predecessor, and he wielded his power much more carefully. Whereas Khrushchev had swung it around like a club, Brezhnev used his with the grace of an orchestra conductor waving his baton. He rarely exercised his power over the Politburo, preferring to state his preference and then defer to the majority. And the Politburo almost always voted along the lines that Brezhnev wanted them to after he expressed his preference, allowing him to maintain the fiction of collective leadership. These men also continued to support Brezhnev because he carefully guarded and supported the status quo. A large part of the dissatisfaction with Khrushchev in the halls of Soviet power was based on his reformism. Khrushchev was fond of reassigning and replacing people in powerful positions. He believed that this kept the country on the cutting edge by constantly rejuvenating its leadership with fresh ideas, even if he closely guarded his own position at the top of the pyramid. This is the main reason that the Politburo and the Presidium eventually turned against him. Their position and privilege in society was at risk. Brezhnev would not make this same mistake. He made an entirely new one. Rather than alienate the powerful by threatening their position, he ensured that their positions were entirely safe, almost no matter what. And during his tenure as General Secretary, there was very little turnover in the leadership of the party and the country, even as those in power grew older and more out of touch with the needs of the country in a rapidly changing world. I will have multiple episodes in the future covering the phenomenon of economic stagnation, but suffice to say for now that this was the period in which technological development and economic growth in the West, particularly in the United States, began to dramatically outpace that in the Soviet Union. In a confidential June 1965 report, Soviet economist Abul Aganbegyan lamented, for instance, that, quote, "the Central Statistical Administration does not have a single computer and is not planning to acquire any," end quote. Computers at the time were nowhere close to what they are today, but computer science was experiencing something of a revolution in the 1960s. While the capitalist economy of the United States, where a very high value was placed on innovation, embraced the computer revolution, Brezhnev's Soviet Union did not. The United States government was relatively quick to realize the value of computers, and the government, as well as the private sector, invested heavily in the industry. The use of computers to track data and make projections gave American manufacturers and large agricultural concerns a major edge over their Soviet counterparts. The use of computers by NASA also allowed the American space program, which had previously lagged behind that of the Soviets, to begin to pull away. Brezhnev's Soviet Union, by contrast, was fast becoming a gerontocracy, that is, ruled by the very old, that not only placed little value on innovation or new technology, but actively rejected it in favor of the status quo. Anything that was new or innovative was seen as a threat to the old order, and the old order was not willing to give in without a fight. This is in stark contrast not just to the capitalist West, but to earlier Soviet regimes as well. We already know that Khrushchev was an energetic and enthusiastic reformer, but even Stalin, though he had shrouded the country in terror and a cult of personality, had recognized the value of innovation and new technology. And where resources were available, he had been quick to embrace innovation and wield new technology in a way that buttressed his regime and the socialist system. This widening gap in economic development was exacerbated by the ongoing arms race with the West. Just at the moment where a greater portion of the economy was needed to develop a backward and fledgling consumer sector, greater and greater portions of the Soviet Union's resources were diverted to military spending, in a desperate attempt to keep up with the military buildup of the United States and her allies. This created a vicious cycle, wherein the more the Soviet economy lagged behind the West, the larger proportion of it was devoted to the military, thus causing the economy to lag behind even more and forcing the Soviets to divert an even larger share to the military. To put this in perspective, the Soviet Union, having less money to begin with, spent significantly less money on the military than the United States. The much larger US defense industry, however, accounted for only about 3% of the nation's GDP, while the Soviet defense industry accounted for somewhere between 11 and 13% of the USSR's GDP, depending on which year you look at it. That same 1965 economic report that I mentioned before estimated that of the roughly 100 million working population of the Soviet Union, about 30 to 40 million of them were working in the defense industry. To sum it up in relatively simple terms, from an economic perspective, it was clear by the late 1960s that the Soviet Union was losing the Cold War. Their smaller, lagging economy simply could not keep up in the arms race. Even Brezhnev could see that the arms race was unsustainable, and it's one of the few areas where he actually broke with the status quo somewhat. For economic as well as moral reasons, Brezhnev sought détente with the West. He engaged diplomatically and concluded multiple arms control and reduction treaties with multiple US administrations. Whatever else he was, Brezhnev was an honest and consistent dealer in foreign affairs, which made him well-liked and well-respected by other world leaders. He's probably the only Soviet leader who got along okay with Richard Nixon, for instance. This engagement and détente did not mean the Cold War was over, but it did become a lot less volatile. Rather than direct confrontation and escalating acts of brinkmanship, the Cold War continued as a war of espionage, sabotage, and proxy wars. The Soviets under Brezhnev, for instance, spent a great deal of money and exerted a great deal of effort in Vietnam. Observers in the Soviet Union could see as well as anybody in the United States or anywhere in the world that by the mid-1960s, the United States was being dragged into a quagmire in Vietnam. The Soviets were careful not to get directly involved, but they did train, equip, and funnel money to America's enemies in Vietnam, hoping to force their enemy into a long, drawn-out conflict that drained their resources and ultimately ended in a humiliating strategic defeat. Those of you who are familiar with the history of the Vietnam War know that in this, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The Americans would get their revenge, however, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. I am planning multiple episodes on this conflict in the not-too-distant future, so stick around for that. Circling back to my point, however, despite Brezhnev's efforts to de-escalate the Cold War, it would continue. And even after the slowing of the nuclear arms race as a result of various treaties and agreements signed by Brezhnev, the level of military spending was simply unsustainable. Plenty of people could see at the time that the whole Soviet system was unsustainable, but Brezhnev and the senior leadership in the Kremlin clung to the status quo, even in the face of obvious need for reform. Brezhnev's leadership style was to govern by consensus of the party leadership, to resist change, and to pursue moderation in all things. When I say Brezhnev was a moderate, I think it's important to point out what I mean when I call him a moderate. I don't mean he was a pragmatic and cautious leader. He often was very cautious, but his caution was not always all that pragmatic. When there was a split over an issue in the Politburo, Brezhnev would often seek to form a compromise by taking a middle road, even when to do so didn't make much sense. For example, in the years after Khrushchev's removal, the question arose, especially among the older, more hardline party members, of how they should treat the legacy of Stalin. The hardliners and conservatives in the government wanted him completely resurrected, but others in the Politburo, including Brezhnev himself, had enthusiastically and publicly embraced Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign. Brezhnev chose to pursue a partial resurrection of Stalin, which kept de-Stalinization officially in place, while also pushing publications praising certain aspects of Stalin's leadership. This led to a confusing and nonsensical public messaging campaign, which held up Stalin as a great wartime leader who helped build socialism, while also continuing to denounce him on an official level. It did not go far enough to please the Stalinists, and it outraged the anti-Stalinist reformers. It also caused a significant backlash among communist parties outside the USSR, among whom, with the exception of Mao's China, opinions of Stalin were less polarized and much more universally negative. Essentially, by taking the middle road in this way, Brezhnev had tried to please everyone and pleased no one. To his credit, I suppose, while nobody was pleased, nobody was outraged enough to get rid of him either, because he refused to commit to extremes in any direction. Some have speculated that Brezhnev so often took the middle road because he was afraid to make any decisions at all, or more critically, because he simply did not understand the issues before him. Dmitry Volkogonov, a Soviet military officer and historian during the Brezhnev era, and later a defense advisor to Russian President Boris Yeltsin, is among the most critical of Brezhnev, constantly referring to what he called Brezhnev's intellectual mediocrity. Volkogonov's view of Brezhnev was universally negative, and at times went so far as to, I think, be unfair to the leader. In his book Autopsy of an Empire, however, I think one passage hits the nail on the head when describing Brezhnev's leadership style. Volkogonov said, quote, "He was a man of one dimension, with the psychology of a mid-level party functionary, vain, wary, and conventional. He was afraid of sharp turns, terrified of reform, but was capable of twisting the party line in whatever direction the hierarchy desired." When you remove the loaded language from that quote, I think it describes Brezhnev to a T. He was skeptical and afraid of change, and yet flexible with the communist ideology so as to be comfortable fitting the desires of the ruling elite into that ideology. I've talked at great length about Brezhnev's efforts to please and placate the party elites, and I think it's merited to say a little more about them. Who were these men so resistant to change and innovation that were leading the Soviet Union into stagnation? The first noteworthy thing about them, which I already alluded to in my phrasing, is that they were almost all men. Only one woman, Yekaterina Furtsova, a holdover from the Khrushchev era, was among the top echelon of the party officials during the Brezhnev era. Though she'd been removed from the Politburo by Khrushchev in 1961, she retained her post as Minister of Culture until 1974. She's the only one. The rest were men. Of those men, roughly 67% were Russian, though Russians made up only about 55% of the population of the USSR. Ukrainians and Belarusians made up most of the rest, with 86% being of Slavic origin. This reality was in stark contrast to the Soviet propaganda, which portrayed the USSR as a great union of friendly nations cooperating in brotherhood with one another. That same propaganda also constantly preached women's liberation and equality. Yet for all their words about equality, the Orwellian reality remained that some were more equal than others. Brezhnev's practice of never dismissing or reassigning anyone in the top echelon of the party also meant that they were overwhelmingly older than the average Soviet citizen. In 1964, when Brezhnev seized power, the average age of a member of the Politburo was approximately 55 years old. When Brezhnev died in 1982, it had risen to 68, and that's the average. Many were far older than that. Around the USSR, the perception was, not incorrectly, that those who held the power in society were old Russian men, and that those who did not meet those demographic qualifications were increasingly marginalized. In the republic-level party apparatus too, even in predominantly non-Slavic republics like Uzbekistan and Central Asia, the party leadership was made up disproportionately of older ethnic Russians. This is in stark contrast to the revolutionary and early Stalin era, when your average Politburo member was in their late 30s or early 40s, though they were still disproportionately Russian. The average age of the Politburo would continue to rise until the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev were instituted in the latter half of the 1980s. Even then, however, it would remain disproportionately Russian. Ordinary Soviet citizens in the early Brezhnev era experienced not only a decline in the growth rate of the economy, but also a decline in social mobility and an increasingly hierarchical society. Stalin had earlier introduced a system of internal passports, a system that, by the way, endures to this day in Russia. Most Russians have two passports, one that they use for international travel and another that they carry with them as internal ID. This passport served to identify where a citizen stood in the hierarchy. The passport identified one's place of residence, and those who lived in Moscow or other major industrial cities of the USSR were in the highest rung of the ladder. The major cities, especially Moscow, had far better access to food and consumer goods. Those living in smaller cities with a population of 500,000 or more had the second best access to resources, and those living in small towns or on collective farms were always the first to suffer from shortages. By the late 1960s, it was very difficult for someone to move from a small town or village to a larger city, because the change of residence in their internal passport had to be justified to and then approved by the Communist Party. Except in circumstances where the person had a special skill that was in dire need by some kind of heavy industry, it was very difficult for someone to move from a small town or village to a bigger city. The average citizen at this time also struggled to get by in an economic system that, to be quite frank, just didn't work. And that's really it. Obviously, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a complicated and multifaceted event. We wouldn't be 21 episodes into this series with no end in sight if it was simple. But if there was one thing that is overarching the entire process of decline, it's the economy. Put simply, central planning of an economy just doesn't work in a large modern economy. That's not a political statement on my part. I'm making no comment as to left versus right or the merits of various social safety net programs. Despite the rhetoric floating around in the West today, that's not really what socialism with a capital S means. I'm talking about a system where the means of production are owned by the state, and state bureaucrats set production levels for various industries to meet the expected demand. These central planners are never able to perfectly predict and adapt to fluctuations in demand, inflation, deflation, and various other unpredictable things that can go wrong in a large, complex economy. Over the years, Soviet planners actually got very good at planning things like heavy industry. How many tractors are needed to harvest crops on this many acres of land? How much steel do we need to produce those tractors? Things like that. They actually got very good at, and that sector of the economy, at least for a while, worked pretty well. What never worked, and what Soviet planners never really caught on or were able to plan effectively, was the consumer economy. One problem that the Soviet economy faced in the late 1960s was inflation of the ruble. Rather than seeing a corresponding increase in prices, as you would in a capitalist economy, however, the state strictly controlled prices, refusing to allow them to increase even as the value of the currency decreased. Generally, an increase in price of a product would cause the demand to fall, as fewer people are willing to pay that price, and the supply will stabilize at a new price. When the price is fixed, however, the demand for a product remains the same or even increases, even as the product becomes more expensive to produce, meaning there is now less of that product on the market to meet the demand. The rise in cost of production without a corresponding decrease in demand in the consumer market leads to demand outstripping supply and shortages of that product. And chronic shortages of consumer products is exactly what the Soviet Union experienced beginning in the late 1960s and early 1970s. At this point in the story, those consumer products that were in short supply were mostly luxury products. Cars, televisions, etc. Things people wanted but didn't necessarily need. As the effects of this economic stagnation compounded into the 1980s, however, the Soviet market would begin to experience dire shortages of the necessities of life. Things like food. This is where we get the famous images of people queuing for bread and empty supermarket shelves in the USSR in the 1980s. Workers in the Soviet Union were generally underpaid for their work, but the law protected their employment. So in most circumstances, short of very extreme and flagrant behavior, they simply couldn't be fired. This led to a phenomenon where, compounding the economic woes of the country, productivity suffered because a lot of people, without hope of advancement nor fear of negative repercussions, simply didn't work very hard. In many industries, it was generally accepted that workers would show up late and take long breaks in the middle of the day to shop and do other things that they didn't want to do during their evening family time. Many workers who had special skills that were in high demand saved their energy for moonlighting, where they would quote-unquote borrow equipment from their state employer and provide their services on the black market in the evening or on their days off. One example of a profession where this was common was auto mechanics. Officially, mechanics worked at state institutions under state direction, just like everybody else, but there was a shortage of both car parts and qualified mechanics on the market. The demand far outpaced the supply. If a person's car broke down, there could be a months-long wait to receive the part they needed and have it installed. But if they could afford to pay 4 to 5 times the official price, they could easily find a mechanic willing to take the part from their employer and install it for the customer on the black market. And people were usually much more willing to take the risk of dealing on the black market than to simply not drive their car for 6 months. Moonlighting was common not just among mechanics, but skilled tradesmen of every stripe. Plumbers and electricians were also in high demand, and it was very common for them to moonlight on the black market as well. Even among unskilled workers, a certain amount of pilfering was common, and as long as it was not excessive, it was usually overlooked. For instance, if someone worked at a chocolate factory, they would sneak a few boxes of chocolate bars out of the factory and bring them home to trade with friends and relatives for other things that they needed. Let's say they have a cousin who works in a bakery and likes chocolate. That chocolate factory worker might trade some chocolate bars that they pilfered from their job to their cousin for some bread that he pilfered from his. Officially, this was a very serious crime, but it was usually overlooked, as there was a general understanding that the system was built in such a way that ordinary people couldn't get by without breaking the rules to some extent. It was also often overlooked because the employers and their Communist Party overseers were often also stealing from the job on a much larger scale than ordinary workers. Such corruption was endemic, and used to feed a thriving black market for goods that were difficult to obtain through official channels. Most current estimates indicate that around 10% of the Soviet economy was illegal, and the black market was such an important piece of the overall economic engine that even the government realized it was not in their interest to shut it down entirely. The black market, or as it was euphemistically referred to in the Soviet Union, the second economy, was so large that it was often an important driver of production in the first or official economy. For example, it was not uncommon for factory managers to purchase raw materials on the black market in order to meet their production quotas. This was often necessary because the raw materials needed to meet those quotas were simply not available through official channels. As we talked about before, there were shortages. Factory managers knew that if they were caught purchasing goods off the black market with state money, they might get in trouble, but they also knew that their punishment would be a slap on the wrist compared to what would happen if they failed to meet the production quota. Regional authorities had an incentive to look the other way, if not outright encourage the behavior, as they too would be in trouble with the central planners in Moscow if the regional quotas weren't met. It was really only when corruption reached a scale large enough that it couldn't be hidden from or ignored by the Politburo in Moscow that anything was actually done about it, as happened in the Uzbek cotton scandal, which I plan to cover in a later episode. In hindsight, it seems clear that an economic system like that of the Soviet Union that cannot function without a black market and large-scale corruption was doomed to failure. But that wasn't clear to everybody at the time. Indeed, the late 1960s and 1970s were probably the most stable time in the history of the USSR. When we talk about nostalgia for the Soviet Union, this is the time period we're usually talking about. People did not have access to the same luxuries and economic opportunity that they did in the West, but people generally had everything they needed. While there were shortages, there were no famines like the ones the country had experienced in the 1930s, even through to the 1950s, and people generally had enough to eat. They had a place to live. Even if young couples who wanted their own place had to live with their parents or in-laws, they were not homeless. And they were guaranteed minimal employment, even if it often wasn't enough to meet all of their needs without a little pilfering on the side. Most people from the former Soviet Union who I know that lived through this time period, not just Russians, but Ukrainians, Georgians, and others, remember it fondly as a positive time when there was stability. But Brezhnev and his colleagues in the Communist Party were already steering the economic ship slowly, ever so slowly, towards an iceberg. And for a while, only economists really realized it. It would be more than a decade before the majority of the country would wake up to the crisis they were in, but by then, it would be too late. The seeds of that disastrous collapse of the 1980s and 90s were undoubtedly planted by the mismanagement of the 1960s and 70s. It wasn't just economic mismanagement at home that contributed to that collapse. Significant missteps in foreign policy also helped plant those seeds, and that will be the subject of my next episode. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I want to give a big thank you and shout out to my patrons and supporters who support the show with monthly donations on Spotify, and also to the Blake Annex for providing me with this studio that I'm using to record this episode. If you're not a supporter yet and you want to be, you can support the show with a monthly donation on Spotify or Patreon. Links to both can be found on my website at www.thehistorysphere.com. Streaming links and links to all of my social media can also be found on the website, as can a list of my sources for this week's episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. If you can't afford to donate right now, but you still want to support the show, you can support us by following and engaging with us on social media. I'm most active on Instagram and TikTok, but I do maintain other social media profiles as well. As I said, those links are available on the website. Most people learn about new podcasts by word of mouth, so you can also support the show by telling your friends about it and encouraging them to give it a listen. Next time, on the History Sphere, I will cover some important highlights of the Soviet Union's foreign policy in the late 1960s, including the Prague Spring and the Brezhnev Doctrine. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.